I heard them decide my fate through a door that was not fully closed. The sound of my life being dismantled was a murmur, as soft and indistinct as the drizzle that perpetually wept against the window panes of my cousin's grander house. My cousin, Clara, whose kindness always came with invisible invoices, was speaking in a tone of strained reason. Her husband, Mr. Harris, a man whose spine was made of candle wax, offered only weary sighs as ballast. They were discussing the dower house, the small, derelict cottage at the farthest edge of the estate, a place where forgotten things went to crumble gracefully into the soil. I was to be the next forgotten thing. "It is for the best, Thomas," Clara had said, her voice a silken rope tightening around my future. "Ilara is quiet. She requires little. The cottage will suit her temperament." Quiet. It was the word they always used for me, a convenient label for a soul they had no inclination to read. I was not quiet. I was listening. I was the silent archivist of their brittle smiles, the overlooked spectator to their hollow courtesies. In a family that prized ornamentation, I was plain, a simple wooden cup in a cabinet of gilded porcelain. My parents had left me with nothing but a good name and a single leather-bound volume of Marcus Aurelius, and in the society of my relations, these were currencies of little worth. So I was to be sent away, tidied into a corner of the estate, where my plainness would not cast a shadow on their polished floors. The cottage, when I first saw it, was even more desolate than their hushed tones had suggested. It slumped against the shoulder of the moor like a tired old man, its thatched roof a matted mess of moss and time, its windows clouded with the cataracts of neglect. Inside, the air was a damp, earthy ghost, and the hearth was a cold, black mouth that had not tasted fire in a generation. Yet, as I stood in the single downstairs room, a strange sense of ownership, fierce and fragile, took root in me. This place, this ruin, was mine. Its silence was a silence I could fill with my own thoughts, its emptiness a canvas I could paint with my own solitude. For 3 weeks this solitude was my only companion. I scrubbed the floors until the pale grain of the wood reappeared like a long-lost memory. I coaxed a reluctant fire to life in the hearth. I patched the worst of the drafts with rags and hope. My days took on a simple, monastic rhythm: fetch water, tend the small vegetable patch, read my one book until the light failed, and then sit by the fire, listening to the wind sing its lonely epics across the moor. I was forgotten, yes, but I was also, for the first time in my life, unbeholden. Then the storm came. It was a violent, theatrical thing, a tantrum of wind and water that tore at the ancient oaks and turned the sky into a bruised purple canvas. It rattled the very bones of my small cottage, and I spent the night huddled by the fire, the roar of the tempest a wild symphony outside my door. By dawn, the world was washed clean and eerily still. It was in this strange, new silence that I found him. He was lying near the old stone wall that marked the boundary of the property, half hidden by a fallen branch. At first, I thought him dead, a traveler caught in the fury of the storm. He was dressed in fine, though now ruined clothes, a gentleman's coat of dark wool, soaked and torn, and boots that spoke of a life lived far from the mud of the moors. There was a dark, ugly gash on his temple, matted with blood and rain. When I knelt beside him, my fingers trembling as I sought a pulse at his neck, I felt a faint, thready beat. He was alive. Getting him back to the cottage was a feat of strength I did not know I possessed. He was a tall man, lean but solid, and his unconsciousness made him a dead weight. I dragged and hauled and pulled, my breath coming in ragged bursts, until at last he was on the cot I had dragged before the fire. I did not think of propriety. I did not think of who he was or what his presence meant. I saw only a fellow creature in need, a piece of flotsam washed up on the shore of my isolation. I cleaned the wound as best I could with boiled water and strips of my own linen. His face, in repose, was severe. It was a face of sharp angles and stark planes, a face that looked as if it had been carved from granite and then left out in the wind and the rain. There were lines of weariness around his eyes and a firm, unyielding set to his mouth. Even unconscious, he possessed an aura of authority, of a man accustomed to command, not to being laid low in a stranger's hut. By nightfall, the fever took him. It was a ravenous thing, burning through him with a terrifying heat. He thrashed and muttered, his words a broken litany of names and places I did not know. For 2 days and 2 nights I did not sleep. I bathed his face with cool cloths, forced sips of water between his cracked lips, and held him down when the tremors shook his powerful frame. In the flickering firelight, his face would soften, the harsh lines dissolving into a startling vulnerability. I saw not the formidable stranger, but a man lost in a dark and lonely country. I was his only guide, his only anchor in the storm of his delirium. On the 3rd morning, the fever broke. I awoke from a brief, exhausted doze in my chair to find him watching me. His eyes were the color of a winter sky, a clear, startling gray, and they were lucid for the first time. The gaze was not a glance, not the polite sweep of a gentleman assessing his surroundings, but a direct, penetrating look of such intensity that it felt as if he were seeing not just my face, but the very architecture of my soul. I felt a blush creep up my neck, a hot, unfamiliar tide of self-awareness. I was in my plainest dress, my hair was a mess of untidy braids, and my hands were rough from work. I was not a sight for any man's eyes, let alone a gentleman's. He tried to speak, but his voice was a dry rasp. I brought him water, my hands suddenly clumsy as I supported his head. He drank deeply, his eyes never leaving my face. When he had finished, he sank back against the thin pillow, his breath still shallow. "Thank you," he whispered, the words a monumental effort. Where am I?" "You are safe," I said, my own voice sounding strange and distant. "You were caught in the storm. You have been unwell." He closed his eyes for a moment, processing this. "My name," he said, opening them again, "is Sterling, Mr. Sterling." It seemed a plain, solid name, a name that suited the unyielding set of his jaw. "I am Alara Vance," I replied. And so began our strange, shared solitude. Mr. Sterling, as I called him, was a quiet patient. He did not complain. He did not demand. He simply watched. His gray eyes followed me as I moved about the small room, tending the fire, preparing the thin broth that was all I had to offer, mending his torn coat with my inexpert stitches. His scrutiny was not judgmental, but deeply, unnervingly observant. It was as if he were cataloging every detail of my small existence, from the way the light caught the dust motes dancing in the air to the precise manner in which I turned the pages of my book in the evenings. As his strength returned, the cottage, which had always felt like a space defined by its emptiness, began to feel small, charged with his presence. He was too large for the room, his long legs stretching out from the cot, his broad shoulders seeming to diminish the very walls. A new tension entered my life, a low hum of awareness that was both unsettling and, if I were honest with myself, strangely welcome. The silence between us was no longer the silence of solitude, but the silence of two people sharing a space, a silence filled with unspoken questions and unvoiced thoughts. One afternoon, about a week into his convalescence, he rose unsteadily from the cot. I rushed to his side, but he waved me away with a gesture that was gentle yet firm. He walked slowly around the room, testing his strength, his hand brushing against the rough-hewn wooden walls. He paused by the window, his gaze fixed on the loose shutter that rattled with every gust of wind. He said nothing, but the next morning I awoke to the sound of rhythmic tapping. I found him outside, a hammer I had not known I possessed in his hand, methodically securing the shutter. He had found my late father's old tool chest, tucked away and forgotten in the small lean-to. He worked for the rest of the day, his movements slow and deliberate, but filled with a surprising competence. He rehung the crooked door so it no longer scraped against the floor. He found loose stones and patched the crumbling section of the hearth. He moved with a quiet, focused energy, and with every nail he hammered, with every stone he set, it felt as if he were not just mending my broken cottage, but mending some broken part of the world itself. It was a secret kindness, an unspoken acknowledgement of my daily struggles. He did not offer me charity or pity. He offered me his labor, a gift of competence that was more profound than any coin. I watched him from the doorway, a lump forming in my throat. No one had ever noticed the rattling shutter. No one had ever cared that the door did not close properly. To my family, these were simply the expected discomforts of my station. To this stranger, they were problems to be solved. That evening, as we sat by the newly silent hearth, the quiet between us felt different, softer, warmer. He gestured to the book lying on the small table beside me. "Marcus Aurelius," he said, his voice no longer a whisper but a low, pleasant baritone. "A stoic companion for a stoic life." I was startled that he recognized it. "You have read him?" I asked. "Many times," he replied, his eyes holding mine. "I have always found his thoughts on endurance clarifying. The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way." He recited the line perfectly, as if it were a piece of his own creed. A key turned in a lock I had not known was there. It was the first time anyone had ever spoken to me about the contents of a book, about the world of ideas that I had always inhabited alone. We talked for hours. We spoke of philosophy and poetry, of the vast, indifferent beauty of the moors, and of the strange comfort to be found in solitude. He listened to me, truly listened, with an attentiveness that made me feel as if my thoughts were things of weight and value. He did not speak of himself, of where he had come from or where he was going. He remained a man without a past, defined only by his presence in my cottage. But in that conversation, I felt I had seen a glimpse of his soul, and he, I suspected, had seen a glimpse of mine. The intellectual connection we forged that night was a delicate, shimmering bridge between our two disparate worlds. It became our ritual. Each evening, after the day's small tasks were done, we would talk. He possessed a mind that was as sharp and clear as a winter morning, and he drew out of me thoughts and opinions I had never dared to voice. He made me feel intelligent. He made me feel interesting. He made me feel seen. This new intimacy was a fragile and terrifying thing. I found myself becoming acutely aware of him, of the way his dark hair curled slightly at his nape, of the quiet strength in his hands, of the rare, fleeting smile that would touch his lips when something I said amused him. One evening, as I reached to add a log to the fire, my hand brushed against his as he reached for the same piece of wood. A jolt, sharp and electric, shot up my arm. We both froze, our fingers just touching on the rough bark. The air in the small room grew thick and heavy, charged with a sudden, palpable tension. His gaze dropped to our hands, and then rose slowly to meet mine. I saw something in his eyes then, a flicker of heat, a depth of emotion that stole the breath from my lungs. He pulled his hand back slowly, as if it cost him a great effort, and the moment was broken. But it left an echo, a shimmering after-image that colored every interaction that followed. He was a man of profound restraint. I knew, with a certainty that had no logical foundation, that he was fighting a battle with himself. I could feel it in the careful distance he maintained between us, in the way he would sometimes fall silent in the middle of a sentence, his jaw tight, as if he had stopped himself from saying too much. A few days later, he asked me a question that felt like a seismic event. We were walking just outside the cottage, the late afternoon sun casting long, golden shadows across the moor. "Ilara," he said, his voice low, "I would be honored if you would permit me to use your Christian name." I stopped, my heart hammering against my ribs. Such a familiarity was unheard of between a man and a woman in our positions. "And I," he continued, turning to face me, the wind ruffling his hair, "am Alistair. I would ask that you call me by it." Alistair. The name felt foreign and intimate on my tongue. I could not bring myself to say it. To do so would be to cross a line, to acknowledge the fragile, impossible thing that was growing between us. "Mr. Sterling," I said, my voice barely a whisper, "it would not be proper." A shadow crossed his face, a flicker of disappointment that he quickly masked. "As you wish," he said, his tone formal once more. But the offer had been made. The intimacy of a name had been extended, a hand reaching out across the chasm of station and circumstance. And I, in my fear, had not taken it. He was well now. The gash on his temple had healed into a thin, white scar, and his strength had fully returned. We both knew he would have to leave soon. The knowledge hung between us, a heavy, unspoken sorrow. The world outside my small cottage, which had ceased to exist for a few precious weeks, was beginning to press in again. I did not know what I would do when he was gone. The silence he would leave behind would be a different kind of silence. Not the peaceful solitude I had once known, but a hollow, aching void. The morning he was to depart was gray and overcast, the sky weeping a soft, persistent drizzle that mirrored the ache in my own heart. He had mended his clothes as best he could, and he stood by the door, once again looking like the gentleman who had washed up on my shore, albeit a slightly more weathered version. He held a small, exquisitely carved wooden horse in his hand. He had whittled it in the evenings from a piece of fallen birch, his long fingers surprisingly deft and patient. "For you," he said, pressing it into my palm. It was a simple thing, but the lines were perfect, capturing the spirit and movement of the animal in the still wood. It was a piece of him, a piece of our shared time. "I do not have the words to thank you, Ilara. You saved my life." "I did what anyone would have done," I said, my eyes fixed on the small, perfect horse. "No," he said, his voice firm. "You did what you would have done. You gave me sanctuary. You gave me peace." He reached out, his fingers gently touching my cheek. It was the first time he had touched me with such deliberate tenderness. His touch was a brand, a fleeting warmth that I knew I would feel for the rest of my days. "I will come back," he promised, his gray eyes intense and serious. "I must settle my affairs, but I will come back for you. Wait for me." And then he was gone. I watched him walk away until he was just a small, dark figure against the vast, gray emptiness of the moor. The cottage felt cavernous without him. The rattling of the newly repaired shutter had been silenced, but a new, more profound emptiness echoed in its place. I waited. I clung to his promise like a drowning woman to a piece of driftwood. But as the days turned into a week, and the week into 2, doubt began to creep in, a cold, insidious fog. Who was he, this Mr. Sterling, this Alistair? He was a gentleman, and I was a poor relation living in a hovel. The world was not a fairy tale. Gentlemen did not return for women like me. The time we had shared, which had felt so real, so profound, began to seem like a fever dream, an illusion born of solitude and circumstance. The village, which I rarely visited, became a source of torment. My cousin's husband had mentioned my guest to the local vicar, and from there the story had grown wings. Mrs. Gable, the wife of the local magistrate and a woman whose charity was always a form of public performance, made it her business to inquire after my welfare. Her inquiries were sharp and pointed, her eyes glinting with malicious curiosity. "A mysterious gentleman, I hear, Ilara," she said one morning, cornering me outside the baker's shop. "One must be so careful. A young woman, alone. Reputations are such fragile things." Her words were honey-laced poison, designed to shame and isolate me. I knew what she was implying. I knew the story she was already weaving in the tapestry of local gossip. I was the foolish spinster who had been taken in by a handsome stranger, a woman whose loneliness had led her to ruin. Her slander was a heavy cloak, and I had no defense against it. My cousin Clara, when she heard the rumors, sent me a terse note advising me to be more circumspect. There was no offer of help, no defense of my character. I was on my own, just as I had always been. The hope that Alistair had planted in me began to wither. Perhaps he had never intended to return. Perhaps his promise was just a polite fiction, a kindness offered to a simple woman he had used for his convenience. The thought was a bitter pill, and I choked on it. It was a Tuesday, 3 weeks to the day since he had left, that my world tilted on its axis. I was outside, weeding my small garden with a kind of grim determination, when I heard it. It was the sound of horses, not the slow plod of a farmer's cart, but the crisp, rhythmic beat of perfectly matched, high-stepping carriage horses. And then it came into view, cresting the small hill on the track that led to the cottage. It was not a carriage. It was a testament. It was a magnificent lacquered black coach, polished to a mirror shine, drawn by 4 perfectly matched gray horses that moved as if they were one. On the door was a coat of arms, a crest of a wolf and a falcon rendered in gleaming gold. 2 footmen in immaculate livery sat at the back, and the driver on the box handled the reins with an air of supreme authority. It was a vision of such wealth and power that it seemed to have driven straight out of a dream. The carriage stopped before my crumbling cottage, the contrast so stark it was almost comical. One of the footmen jumped down and opened the door. I stood, frozen, my hands covered in dirt, my heart a wild, panicked bird in my chest. I expected a bewigged official to emerge, perhaps someone come to question me about the stranger, to accuse me of some crime. But the man who stepped out of the carriage was Alistair. He was transformed. He was dressed in a coat of the finest dark blue superfine, tailored to perfection. His boots were polished to a gleam that rivaled the coach itself. He looked taller, more formidable. A man who did not simply occupy a space, but commanded it. He was not Mr. Sterling, the quiet convalescent. This was a lord, a prince, a man from another world entirely. My crisis of trust was instantaneous and absolute. It was a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs. Every shared word, every quiet glance, every moment of connection was instantly recontextualized. It was all a lie. The simplicity, the shared solitude, it had been a game for him, a pastoral diversion for a great lord weary of his life. I was not a kindred spirit he had found. I was a rustic curiosity, a chapter in his adventure. The kindness he had shown me, his mending of my home, now seemed like the idle pastime of a nobleman, a form of noblesse oblige that meant nothing. The shame was a hot, scalding wave. I had been a fool. He saw the look on my face. He took a step toward me, his own expression a mixture of anxiety and resolve. "Ilara," he began. I held up a hand, my palm still smudged with earth. It felt like a pathetic shield against the sheer force of his new reality. "You should not have come back," I said, my voice shaking with a cold fury I had never known I possessed. "Your little holiday is over, my lord. You may return to your world. You have had your amusement." The pain that flashed in his eyes was so raw, so genuine, that it momentarily pierced my own wall of hurt. "It was never an amusement," he said, his voice low and urgent. He dismissed the carriage and its occupants with a single, sharp gesture. They retreated down the track, leaving us alone once more in the shadow of my humble cottage. But the image of the ducal crest was burned into my mind. "Duke," I whispered, the word tasting like ash. "You are a duke." "I am," he confirmed, his gaze unwavering. "Alistair Sterling, the Duke of Blackwood. And it is the most useless and burdensome thing about me." He walked toward me, but this time he did not stop. He came right up to me, close enough that I could see the flecks of silver in his gray eyes, the weary lines that his fine clothes could not conceal. "I did not tell you because, for the first time in 10 years, I did not want to be the Duke of Blackwood. I wanted to be a man, just a man." My title is a fortress, Elara, and I have lived inside its walls for so long, I had forgotten what it felt like to breathe fresh air. The storm that nearly killed me, it was a kind of escape. I was riding aimlessly, trying to outrun the ghost of my late wife on the anniversary of her death. And I found you. In this cottage, with you, I was not a duke. I was just Alistair. And you saw him. You saw the man, not the title. His confession was a torrent, his words stripped of all artifice. He looked not powerful but profoundly vulnerable. I know the rumors that have been spread, he continued, his voice hardening with anger. I know what Mrs. Gable has been saying. I rode into the village before I came here. I paid a visit to her husband. I stared at him, confused. Magistrate Gable, it seems, has some significant debts, Alistair said, a grim satisfaction in his tone. Debts which I have now acquired. I made it very clear to him that the continuation of my goodwill is entirely dependent on his wife's sudden and complete inability to recall your name for any purpose other than polite and respectful greeting. Your reputation will not be troubled by her again. He had defended me. He had not used his power to threaten or bully, but had moved with a quiet, strategic precision to protect me. He had seen the wound that society had inflicted on me, and had sutured it without me even knowing. It was a proactive defense, a demonstration of his care that went beyond mere words. Everything I said in this cottage was true, he said, his voice softening again. Everything I felt was real. The only lie was one of omission, and it was a lie I told to myself as much as to you. I did not plan to be injured. I did not plan to be found by a woman with more integrity in her little finger than my entire social circle possesses in its entirety. I did not plan for you to unmake me, Elara. I did not plan for your quiet strength to dismantle every wall I have ever built around my heart. You have been in my every thought since the moment I left. Coming back here, to you, has been the only thing that has made any sense. His declaration was not the flowery prose of a poet, but the stark, unvarnished truth of a man laying his soul bare. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever heard. The anger and hurt in my heart did not vanish, but they were soothed by the balm of his sincerity. I saw him then, not as the Duke, not as Mr. Sterling, but as Alistair, a man who was lonely and burdened, and who had found a moment of peace in my quiet world. I finally looked down at the wooden horse still clutched in my hand. You promised you would return, I whispered, acknowledging the truth of his words. I will always return to you, he said, his voice thick with emotion, if you will have me. My reciprocation was not a grand speech. It was a single, shaky nod. It was the acceptance of a truth that my heart had known long before my mind was willing to believe it. It was a quiet surrender to a hope I had thought was lost. He reached out and took my dirty hand in his, lacing his fingers through mine. The chasm between the Duke and the poor relation vanished, and we were simply a man and a woman, standing in a neglected garden, having found our way back to each other. Section. He did not take me away in the grand carriage that day. Instead, he sent it on to the nearest town to wait, and he stayed. He stayed for another week, but this time it was different. There were no secrets between us. He told me of his life, of the crushing weight of his duties, of the profound loneliness that had followed his first wife's death years ago, a marriage of arrangement that had been cordial but loveless. And I, in turn, told him of my own small life, of my love for books and my quiet observations, of my feeling of being perpetually on the outside, looking in. On Saturday, he said, "We are going into the village." A knot of anxiety tightened in my stomach. The village was the domain of Mrs. Gable and her ilk. It was the place of my humiliation. "Why?" I asked. "Because," he said, his expression firm, "we are not going to live in hiding. I will not have you skulking in the shadows. You are going to hold your head high, and you are going to be seen with me." He walked with me down the muddy track, his arm linked through mine. He wore the simple, mended clothes of Mr. Sterling, but he carried himself with the innate authority of the Duke of Blackwood. It was a powerful combination. As we entered the village square, a hush fell. People stopped and stared. I could feel their eyes on me, 100 tiny needles of curiosity and judgment. I saw Mrs. Gable standing near the apothecary, her face a mask of disbelief and fury. She made her move, as he had known she would. She could not resist the opportunity to try and reassert her dominance. She swept toward us, her silk dress rustling with indignation. "Well, Ilara," she began, her voice dripping with condescension, "I see your friend has returned." She pointedly ignored Alistair, her gaze fixed on me, designed to diminish and dismiss. Alistair stopped. He turned to face her, his expression calm, almost placid, but his gray eyes were as cold and hard as river stones. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The sheer, quiet force of his presence was enough to make the air crackle. "Madam," he said, his tone dangerously soft, "you will address Miss Vance with the respect she is due, and you will address me as your grace." He paused, letting the words sink in, letting the title land with the weight of a physical blow. Mrs. Gable's face went from pink to white. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish. "But you will not have much cause to address me at all," he continued, his voice still level. "For neither Miss Vance nor I have any desire to cultivate an acquaintance with those who mistake malice for wit." He then turned his gaze to me, and the coldness in his eyes melted away, replaced by a warmth that was for me alone. "Ilara, my dear, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife, of becoming the Duchess of Blackwood?" He had asked me this, not in the privacy of the cottage, but here, in the village square, in front of everyone who had ever looked down on me, who had ever whispered about me. It was not a proposal. It was a coronation. It was a public vindication so absolute, so complete, that it left no room for doubt or slander. He was not just claiming me. He was elevating me, placing me under his unequivocal protection. I looked from his earnest, hopeful face to the stunned, gaping expressions of the villagers, to the utter ruin of Mrs. Gable's social standing. The fear I had felt moments before was gone, replaced by a soaring, dizzying sense of empowerment. I was no longer the overlooked, plain Ilara Vance. I was the woman this incredible man had chosen. "Yes," I said, my voice clear and steady. "Yes, Alistair, I will." Without another glance at the assembled villagers, we turned and walked away, leaving a tableau of shattered assumptions behind us. We walked out of the village and up the path that led to the high moor, the place where the wind always blew and the sky felt close enough to touch. When we reached the crest of the ridge, with the whole world spread out beneath us, he stopped and turned to me. The private aftermath of our public victory was a profound and sacred silence. The wind whipped strands of hair across my face, and he gently brushed them away. His hands came up to cup my face, his thumbs stroking my cheekbones. "Ilara," he breathed, his name a prayer. And then he kissed me. It was not a kiss of frantic passion, but one of slow, deep, and shaking reverence. It was the culmination of everything that had passed between us, the shared silence, the fevers, the conversations by the fire, the mended shutter, the wooden horse. It was a kiss that tasted of promises kept and a future found. It was the sealing of a bond forged not in a ballroom or a drawing room, but in the heart of a storm, in a small, forgotten cottage where a duke had learned to be a man and a quiet woman had learned to be seen. It was the final, perfect resolution, the beginning of our story. 6 months later, I stood in the great library of Blackwood Manor. It was a room so vast it seemed to hold the sky, with towering shelves of books stretching up into the shadows, and a grand fireplace large enough to stand in. When I had first arrived, the sheer scale of the place had intimidated me. It was a world of unimaginable wealth and history, a world I did not belong to. But I had been wrong. A home, I had learned, is not about the grandeur of the walls, but about the person who waits for you within them. Alistair had made this place my home. He had filled it not just with his presence, but with his respect for mine. He had given me free rein of the library, this sanctuary of knowledge, and had taken as much delight in my discoveries as I had. I ran my hand over the spine of a familiar book, a new, beautifully bound edition of Marcus Aurelius. It had been his wedding gift to me. I heard the door open and turned to see him standing there, a soft smile on his face. He had come in from riding, and he looked much as he had that first day, strong, vital, and real. "I thought I might find you here," he said, his voice the sound I now associated with peace. He came and stood behind me, wrapping his arms around my waist and resting his chin on my shoulder. We stood together in comfortable silence, looking out the great window at the rolling parkland. My cousin Clara had visited once, her eyes wide with a mixture of envy and awe, her kindness now cloying and desperate. Mrs. Gable had long since retreated into obscurity. The world that had once defined and confined me had become a distant memory. My final reflection was not one of triumph, but of quiet gratitude. I had not been a damsel in distress, rescued by a prince. I had been a woman in a quiet harbor, and he had been a ship battered by a storm, seeking refuge. We had rescued each other. He had given me a place in the world, and I had given him a place where his title did not matter. I had learned that true worth is not measured by society's appraisal, but by the quiet, steady recognition in the eyes of the one who truly sees you. Home was not the derelict cottage or the grand manor. Home was here, in the circle of his arms, in the shared silence of a library, in the simple, profound peace of being known.